The plaster cast weighs almost 14 pounds. I keep it in a cardboard box under my desk at the Harper's Ferry Ranger Station, wrapped in an old flannel shirt I have not worn since the autumn of 2019. Every so often, when a new hire asks about the shirt, I tell them it belonged to a friend. That is true. What I do not tell them is that the cast underneath the shirt is the last physical proof I have that anyone was ever there beside me at all. The cast is of a footprint, 19 inches long, 7¼ inches wide at the ball. The toes are splayed, unnaturally so, and the arch is deeper than any human foot should sit. When I hold it up to the fluorescent light in the storage closet, I can still see faint striations along the sole, the same striations that appear on skin that has walked barefoot over rock and root for a very long time. I do not show it to the new hires. They laugh too easily. Before I go any further into what happened along the Shenandoah that year, I want you to do something small for me. If this story reaches you, if it settles somewhere behind your ribs the way stories are meant to, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel so I can find you again next week, and leave a comment. Tell me the first sound you would notice if you were alone in the woods and every bird went quiet at once. I read every comment. Some of them keep me up. Now, let me take you back. October in Harper's Ferry begins with color and ends with silence. The tourists thin out after Columbus Day. The Appalachian Trail through hikers going southbound are already past us by then, chasing the last warm nights toward Georgia. What remains, when the leaves turn from red to rust to nothing at all, is a small crew of us. 4 full-time federal employees, 2 seasonals we keep on for maintenance, and the town itself, which shrinks around the point where the Potomac meets the Shenandoah until it feels less like a town and more like something a river forgot to carry off. I had been assigned to the historical park for 11 years, long enough to know the shape of every path, long enough to know the sound the water makes at each bend of Loudon Heights, at each rock along Virginius Island, at each stretch of the towpath where the sycamores lean over the water like eavesdroppers. Long enough to know that when the pileated woodpeckers went quiet 3 days in a row, something was wrong. The first call came in on a Tuesday. A woman named Delphine Fitzgerald had reported that her husband Marcus had not returned from a day hike along the Loudon Heights Trail. He had left his sedan in the pull-off near the highway bridge and taken with him a bottle of water, a granola bar, and a small compact camera because he liked to photograph fungi. That was the entire kit. He was 58 years old, not out of shape, but not a serious hiker either. He had 2 grandchildren, a golden retriever named Bishop, and a habit of texting his wife every 90 minutes because she liked to know he was breathing. By the time the call reached me, he had been missing for 19 hours. I remember the exact way my radio sounded that morning. Not because the tone was different, but because I had been reaching for coffee when it broke the silence, and the mug slipped a little in my hand, spilling 3 drops onto the report I had been reading. The report was about noise complaints from Bolivar Heights the previous weekend. Someone had heard what they described as, and I quote from memory, a woman screaming in the trees for 40 minutes. No woman had been reported missing that weekend. No body had been found. The complaint had been filed and then forgotten, the way small strange things always are in a town that keeps its ghosts on official rosters. I finished my coffee before I keyed the mic. The dispatcher was a woman named Reyes, who worked out of the county office. She had a voice like an old radio, flat and steady, the kind of voice you want in your ear when things are going to hell. She gave me the coordinates of the sedan, the description of the missing man, the name of the trail he had likely taken, and the number of hours since the last text his wife had received. I wrote it all down on the back of the noise complaint report because the notepad was in the other room, and I did not want to move yet. There was a moment, after she signed off, when I sat very still and looked at the 2 pieces of information stacked on top of each other on the same sheet of paper. A woman screaming in the trees. A man missing on the ridge above where she had been heard. Coincidence is a word that ranger training teaches you to respect. Pattern is a word it teaches you to fear. I called Delphine Fitzgerald from the office line. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was worn thin from crying, but she was holding herself upright the way people do when they still believe that being organized might save someone. She confirmed everything the dispatcher had told me. Marcus had texted her at 4:17 the previous afternoon with a picture of a chicken of the woods fungus growing on an oak stump. He had written, and I am reading this from a copy she later sent me, "Big beauty, coming down in an hour, love you." He had never come down. I told her I was heading out immediately. I told her I would call her the moment I had anything. I did not tell her about the noise complaint. There was no point in feeding her a fear I did not yet have a shape for. I packed my day pack the way I always pack it. Water, emergency bivvy, compass, backup radio, first aid, 2 power bars, a small folding saw, wool gloves and a Ziploc. My service weapon, which I have drawn 3 times in 11 years, and fired 0. And, because something in the back of my brain was already whispering, a second cartridge of pepper spray rated for grizzly. We do not have grizzly in West Virginia. We have not had grizzly in West Virginia for 200 years. I brought it anyway. The drive out to the pull-off took 8 minutes. The sedan was still there, coated in a fine layer of leaf dust that told me nobody had brushed against it since the previous afternoon. Through the windshield I could see a paper coffee cup in the console, empty, and a set of keys on the driver's seat where he had tossed them, locked out on purpose. He had not planned to come back to the car quickly. I called in my location. Reyes acknowledged. I hitched my pack and started up the trail. The Loudon Heights Loop is not a difficult hike. 6 miles round trip, moderate grade, mostly under a canopy of oak and hickory with a few stretches of mountain laurel that get thick enough to hide a bear if the bear does not want to be seen. In October, the leaves are ankle deep in the low sections, so a person moving off trail leaves a scuff you can read for hours. I looked for scuffs. I did not find any at first. That in itself was not unusual. Marcus was a fungus photographer. He would have stayed on trail until something caught his eye. Half a mile in, the woodpeckers went quiet. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had turned a dial. I stopped walking and listened for the wind, which was the only sound left. It was moving through the tops of the trees, and I could hear leaves ticking against each other high up. But on the ground the world had gone still enough that I could hear the blood in my own ears. That is where I want to leave you, for now. Standing on the Loudon Heights Trail with a bottle of water in my pack and a stranger's face in my head and the woods holding their breath around me. I will pick it up on the other side. I walked for another 40 minutes in that silence before I found the first sign of him. It was the camera. A small silver point-and-shoot, older model, the kind that still uses AA batteries. It was lying face down in a bed of dead ferns about 8 feet off the trail on the downhill side. The strap was still looped through it. The lens cap was gone. When I picked it up, the plastic body was cold and damp with dew, which told me it had been there at least overnight. It had not been dropped from a great height. It had been set down carefully, or it had fallen from a height of about human waist as a person was turning to run. I marked the location with a strip of pink flagging tape tied to a low branch and photographed the camera in place with my own phone before I moved it. Then I turned it over. The lens was still intact. The battery door was closed. The little red light on the top blinked twice as I handled it, which meant there was still power in it, which meant it had not been sitting there for weeks. I turned it on. The last picture Marcus Fitzgerald ever took was of the chicken of the woods fungus he had texted his wife about. It was a good picture, well framed, well focused, the orange shelves of the fungus catching a slant of afternoon light. I clicked back to the picture before that. It was a picture of his own boots resting on a moss-covered log, the kind of shot people take when they sit down to eat their granola bar. I clicked back again. It was a picture of the trail marker at the halfway point of the loop. I clicked forward again, past the fungus, expecting the next picture to be another fungus, or a leaf, or a squirrel. The next picture was a blur. Whatever he had aimed at, he had been moving when he pressed the button, or the thing had been moving, or both. The frame was mostly brown and green with a slash of gray diagonal across the middle. There was no shape I could name in it, but if I looked at the top edge, in the upper right corner, there was a small dark oval that could have been a shoulder, or an ear, or a very large clenched fist. It could also have been nothing. I have looked at that picture perhaps 400 times since then. It is still nothing. It is still not nothing. There were no pictures after that one. I put the camera in a plastic evidence bag, sealed it, wrote the date and time on the bag with a permanent marker, and put it in my pack. Then I stood up and I looked around. The ferns where the camera had been resting were pressed down in a rough circle about 4 feet across. Not the way an animal beds down, not the way a person kneels. Something had crouched there, low to the ground, weight concentrated at the front. I looked further downslope. 20 feet below me, there was a smear of black soil where the leaf mat had been kicked aside. Beyond that, another smear. Beyond that, snapped saplings at about 7 feet off the ground. Something big had moved through here fast, going downhill, angling toward the river. I called it in. Reyes acknowledged and started assembling a search team out of county resources. She told me to hold my position. I told her I was going to follow the sign for another 200 yards to see if I could get eyes on him. She told me not to. I told her I was doing it anyway. She said, in her flat old radio voice, "Be careful out there and stay in contact every 10 minutes. I followed the sign. The snapped saplings ran for about 150 yards down the slope before they thinned out. The smears of black soil kept going. I saw one clear track in a patch of clay where a spring seep had softened the ground. Not a footprint yet, a knuckle print. 5 knuckles, arranged in a shallow arc, pressed deep enough that a fingernail of dark mud was pushed up at the front edge. A hand that had been used to push off from the ground while running. The hand was as wide as my 2 hands laid side by side. I stood over that print for a long time. I photographed it. I set my compass down next to it for scale. I noted the direction of travel. Then I did the thing that all my training had told me not to do. I kept following. 200 yards later, I found the second track. A footprint this time, only partial. The ball and toes pressed into a soft mound of leaf mold at the base of a boulder. It was the print I would later cast. It was the print that has sat under my desk in that cardboard box for the past 7 years. I did not cast it that day. That day I photographed it, measured it with the folding tape from my pack, and marked the location. Then I called in again. This time when I told Reyes what I was seeing, there was a long pause on the other end. She said, and I remember this exactly, "Sit tight. I am escalating." I sat down on the boulder next to the print. I did not want to. Something in the woods around me had come alive in a way that felt wrong. The birds had not come back, but there was a different sound now, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from further down the slope. 2 taps, a pause, 2 taps, a pause, like someone knocking politely on a door in the middle of the forest and waiting for someone else to answer. I did not answer. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. Then it started again, from a different direction. Further to my left, higher up the slope this time. Then a third tapping started, from behind me. 3 taps, 3 directions, all around me. And the taps were not exactly in rhythm with each other, but they were not random either. They were talking. Whatever was making them was talking to itself across the trees, and I was inside the conversation. My radio hissed. Reyes came back on. She said the county was sending a helicopter for aerial search, and a K9 team was en route, and I needed to walk back to the trailhead immediately. I stood up slowly. The tapping stopped again, all 3 sources at once. I walked. I did not run. Running in the woods is a mistake. Running triggers things. I walked at a steady pace back up the slope, keeping my breathing even, my eyes forward, my hand near the pepper spray on my belt. I did not look back. I did not look up into the canopy. I did not stop when I heard, at one point, the distinct sound of something heavy shifting its weight in the leaves about 30 yards behind me. I just walked. I made it back to the trail. I made it back to the trailhead. I made it back to my truck. That evening, the K9 team ran the trail 4 times. The dogs would not go past the point where I had found the camera. They sat down in the ferns and whined and would not move. Their handler, a woman named Roe, told me she had never seen her dogs do that before. Not for a bear, not for a mountain lion, not for a body. Just for whatever had been standing there in that circle of ferns waiting for a fungus photographer to come around the bend. Marcus Fitzgerald was never found. The next morning at 6:15, a young couple named Peria reported that their friends, another young couple, had failed to return the night before from a sunset hike on Maryland Heights. They had been carrying a bottle of wine and a blanket and a portable speaker playing what the Peria couple described as, quote, indie folk stuff, unquote. The speaker had been found by another hiker at dawn, still playing, propped against a boulder along the ridge. The blanket had been found 40 yards downhill. The wine bottle had been found smashed against a rock 100 yards below that. The couple themselves had not been found. By 11 that morning, the incident had been reclassified from a search and rescue to a search and recovery. By noon, the county had requested federal assistance. By 4 in the afternoon, I was on the phone with a regional office in Charleston, giving them the exact same story I have just told you. And the man on the other end of the line said something that surprised me. He said, "Hold on. There is a group we call in for this. Their number is unlisted. I will have them contact you." They arrived the next morning in 3 vehicles. The lead vehicle was a battered gray pickup truck with North Carolina plates and a bed cap that had been repainted so many times you could see the different layers peeling at the corners. The second vehicle was a green Suburban with tinted windows and a small round decal on the rear window that I did not recognize at the time. A stylized bird carrying a branch in its beak. The third vehicle was another pickup. This one blue, older, with a canoe strapped to the roof rack even though there was no water within a quarter mile of my station that would take a canoe. They pulled into the ranger station lot at 7:43 in the morning. I know the time because I had been standing at the window with my second cup of coffee, watching the fog burn off the ridge when the trucks came up the drive. 9 people got out. The first out of the lead pickup was a man in his early 30s, tall, lean, with a long braid down his back that was dark except for one streak of gray at the temple. He wore work boots and canvas pants and a canvas jacket over a wool shirt. He carried nothing in his hands. He walked toward the station door with the easy stride of someone who has spent his life walking. When he came inside, he introduced himself as Tecumseh, just the one name. He shook my hand once, briefly, and his palm was dry and warm and calloused. Behind him came an older man, maybe 70, with silver hair cropped close and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that looked like the bark of a river birch. His hands were enormous. He introduced himself as Yanagiska and told me he was the eldest of the group, and that Tecumseh spoke for them in most matters, but he, Yanagiska, would speak if a decision needed to be made that the young man did not feel ready to make. It was said without pride and without shame. It was just the arrangement. The third to come inside was a woman about Yanagiska's age, small, wiry, with a long gray braid and a pair of wire-framed glasses that she pushed up onto her forehead when she looked at me directly. She introduced herself as Junaluska. She was carrying a leather satchel that clinked softly when she set it down on my desk. When I looked at her, I had the immediate and uncomfortable sensation that she was reading something on the inside of my skull that I had not read myself yet. The next 3 came in together, and I noticed at once that 2 of them were brothers. Not twins exactly, but close enough in feature that anyone would guess. The taller of the 2 introduced himself as Major Ridge. The shorter, who wore his hair loose and had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow up into his hairline, introduced himself as John Ridge. The man with them was older, quieter, with the kind of face that never quite showed what it was thinking. He said his name was Stan Waddy, and he did not offer his hand. He offered a nod instead. I nodded back. A woman came in behind them, younger than the rest, maybe 25, with a notebook and a small digital recorder clipped to her belt. She said her name was Corn Tassel, and that she was the one who would be writing everything down. She said that word, everything, in a way that told me she was serious about it. She had been recording since she stepped out of the Suburban. She had already been recording when I opened the door. The last 2 came in together, and they were the strangest pair of the group. The first was a very old man, older even than Yanagiska, with a stiff walk that told me his knees had been giving him trouble for decades. He introduced himself as Akanostota and said he had been in the field for 53 years, and he was tired, but he had come because Yanagiska had asked him to come. The man beside him was the youngest of the group, but the most physically imposing, thick through the chest and shoulders, with hands that had the knuckles of a fighter and eyes that were already scanning the room, the way a man scans a room he expects to have to fight his way out of. He said his name was Chickamauga, and he said it the way a man says a name he has chosen for himself, not the way a man says a name he was given. 9 people, in my office, standing in a loose half-circle around my desk. Yanagaska spoke first. He said, "We understand that you have had 2 disappearances in 3 days, and that your dogs will not track past a certain point on the mountain, and that you have found a print," he said. "We would like to see the print." I opened the cardboard box under my desk. It was not yet the box that held a cast. It was still just the box that held the photographs I had printed at the station the night before, along with my notes and the evidence bag with Marcus Fitzgerald's camera in it. I laid the photographs out on the desk. Yanagaska looked at the picture of the knuckle print for a long time without speaking. Junaluska leaned over his shoulder and looked at the same picture and made a small sound in her throat that might have been recognition and might have been sorrow. Okanastota picked up the picture of the partial footprint and held it at arm's length because his eyes were not what they had been, and after a moment he set it back down on the desk and said, in a soft voice, "This is the one my father told me about." Chickamauga was the first to speak in a normal tone. He said, "How many people know about this outside of your office?" I told him that my dispatcher knew, and the county sheriff knew, and my regional office knew, and the K-9 handler named Rowe knew, and the FBI liaison who had been assigned to the case as of that morning knew. He nodded once, tightly, and said, "We will need to keep it to those people only. No press, no public statement, no social media from your junior staff. Not until we understand what we are dealing with." I told him I would handle that. I asked him what they thought we were dealing with. There was a silence in the room. It was not the silence of people who did not know the answer. It was the silence of people deciding whether to share it with me. Yanagaska finally said, "In our language we have several names for what leaves that kind of print. In English, the newspapers and the television shows have their own names for it. We do not use those names. We do not use them because names have weight, and the weight of the wrong name can pull the wrong thing to you." He said, "We will explain more when we are camped. For now, please understand that we do not want to hunt this creature. We want to speak with it. If speaking with it fails, we will do what we have to do, but we will try to speak with it first." Tecumseh spoke then for the first time since he had come in the door. He said, "Ranger, we will need a base camp somewhere near the trailhead, off the road, not visible from the highway. We will need permission to be in the park after dark. We will need you to keep the trails closed to civilians for as long as it takes, and we will need you with us. You have already been to the place. It knows your scent. That may help, it may not. But leaving you behind now would be worse than bringing you along." I looked around the office at 9 faces I had known for less than 15 minutes. I said, "When do we start?" Junaluska said, "We started when the birds went quiet. We set the camp that afternoon in a small clearing about a quarter mile up an unmaintained fire road, close enough to the Loudon Heights trailhead to walk in, but hidden enough that no passing motorist would notice the vehicles. Stan Waddy and the Ridge brothers strung the tarps in a low, tight configuration that made me realize immediately that all 3 of them had been in the military. There was no wasted motion. Every stake went in on the first strike. The tarps did not flap in the wind because they were tensioned in a way that spread the pull evenly across all 4 corners. Corn Tassel sat on a folding stool with her notebook open and made a diagram of the camp layout. Every tent, every fire ring, every direction of approach. She labeled the ranger station as a red X in the corner of her page and drew an arrow toward it that said, "Retreat point, 13-minute walk." Then she looked up at me and said, "Do you carry a satellite communicator or just the radio?" I told her just the radio, and she wrote that down too. Junaluska built a small fire in a shallow pit and boiled water in a battered kettle. She poured cups of a dark tea for each of us. When she handed me mine, she said, "Drink it slow. It has yarrow and some other things. It will settle your stomach for the walk." I asked her what other things. She smiled and said, "Older things than you would know the names of. Drink it." I drank it. It tasted like dirt and mint and something faintly sweet at the finish. My stomach did settle. I had not realized how tight it had been. While we drank, Yanagiska began to speak. He said that the beings we were looking for were not new to this ridge, or to these rivers, or to this continent. He said his own people, and the peoples of Junaluska and Tecumseh and Chickamauga and the Ridge Brothers and the older nations that had lived along the Potomac and the Shenandoah for thousands of years before any of them, had known these beings for as long as there had been ears to hear them tapping in the trees. He said that in the mountains of the southeast, where his own family had come from before they had been removed west and then had come back to the mountains generations later, the beings had been called by a word that meant, roughly, the ones who walk in the deep places and do not want to be seen. In the north, where Tecumseh's people had lived, they had been called by a word that meant, roughly, the tall watchers. There were other words in other languages. There were words in the languages of the peoples who had lived here before his people, whose languages were gone now, and whose words for the beings had to be reconstructed from what the newer arrivals had heard the older residents say before those older residents had also been pushed out or died. He said that the beings had rules. I asked, "What rules?" He said, "The rules are old and they are simple. First, they do not want to be seen. If you see one of two things has happened. Either the being wants you to see it, which means it is choosing to speak with you, and you must speak with it carefully, or the being does not know you are there, which means you must make yourself known immediately, because if you frighten it, it will hurt you without meaning to. Second, he said, they do not want to be hunted. If a hunter comes into their part of the forest with the intention of killing them, they know it. They know it the way we would know a wolf had come to our door, and they respond as we would respond. They defend themselves. Third, he said, they do not like noise that has no purpose. Small sounds are fine. A person talking to another person is fine. A person singing quietly to themselves as they walk is fine. What they do not like is the loud, empty noise that people bring into the woods with them because they are afraid of silence. Machines, radios, portable speakers. He looked at me when he said the last part. I looked back at him. I said, one of the missing hikers was playing music from a portable speaker when he disappeared. Yunageska nodded slowly. He said, we thought so. Junaluska added, quietly. The fourth rule is the most important, she said. They know grief. They have their own grief. If one of theirs is hurt or killed, they mourn. And if they think that we, meaning the humans, are the ones who did the hurting or the killing, they answer. I asked, has one of theirs been hurt or killed recently? Okonostota, who had been silent for most of the afternoon, said, we do not know yet, but something has changed on this ridge in the last month. We have been watching the reports come in from the small towns up and down the valley. We have been watching the news that never makes the news. There has been more movement than there should be. There have been more sightings, even if most of them are dismissed as bears. There have been more small, strange things, and now there are people missing. He said, something has stirred them up. We are here to find out what. The Ridge brothers, who had been listening in silence, spoke for the first time. Major Ridge said, we have been on trails like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough, he said. In the mountains of Kentucky in 2011, in upstate New York in 2016, in the Alleghenies in 2019, just this past spring, he said. We do not always find them. When we do find them, we do not always come home with the same number we left with. John Ridge said, we tell you this because you deserve to know before you follow us up onto that ridge tonight. I sat with my empty teacup in my hand, and I looked at each of them in turn. I said, one of the men who is missing has a wife who calls me every 4 hours. She is not going to stop calling. Whatever we are going to do, we should do it tonight. Chickamauga smiled for the first time. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who has been waiting for someone to say the thing he was going to say himself. Tecumseh said, we will go in at last light. Stand Waddy will take the high line along the ridge with the long rifle. He will not shoot unless we are being killed, and there is no other way. Junaluska and Yanaguska will hold the center camp and watch the fire. The rest of us will go up in 2 groups. Ranger, you are with me. Corntassel, you are with the Ridge brothers. Okonostota, you are with Chickamauga. We will meet at the print. We will proceed from there. Corntassel said, "One more thing." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small stack of what looked like dried herbs wrapped in a bundle. She unwrapped it and separated it into 9 smaller bundles and gave one to each of us. She said, "If you get separated from the group, and if you find yourself in a place where you cannot see us and cannot hear us, light one of these. It will smolder for about 2 hours. It will not scare the being away. It might do the opposite, but it will let us find you." I put mine in the chest pocket of my jacket. I could smell it faintly through the fabric. Sage and cedar and something bitter I did not recognize. We waited for the light to fall. While we waited, Junaliska took me a short distance from the fire and said, "Ranger, may I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "When you were on the trail alone and you heard the tapping, did you answer?" I said, "No." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Good." She said, "If we hear it tonight, do not answer." She said, "No matter what it sounds like. No matter if it sounds like it is asking you a question you know the answer to. No matter if it sounds like it is calling you by name. Do not answer." I said, "Does it call people by name?" She said, "Sometimes, when it wants to." The light began to fall. We went up the ridge. The trail into Loudon Heights at dusk is a different trail than the one at midday. The trees crowd closer. The leaves underfoot make a sound that is somehow louder in the fading light than in the sunshine. The rivers, which you cannot see from most of the trail but can hear if you stop, take on a different tone. The Potomac and the Shenandoah both run below the ridge, and where they meet at the point they make a sound that is not the sound of either river alone. It is a lower, older sound. It is the sound of 2 currents that do not entirely agree. We walked in file. Tecumseh in front, me behind him, then the Ridge brothers and Corntassel, then Oconostota and Chickamauga. Stand Watie had gone ahead an hour earlier by a different route to take up his position on the High Line. I did not see him leave. I did not see him again for the rest of that night, except at the very end. We did not speak on the walk in. Nobody used a flashlight. There was enough moon through the bare canopy that once your eyes adjusted you could follow the pale ribbon of the trail. Tecumseh moved without a sound. I moved with what I hoped was quiet but knew was not, because I could hear my own boots crunching the leaves and I knew everybody behind me could hear them too, and nobody complained because everybody had understood that I was the loudest walker in the group and everybody had accepted it. We reached the ferns where the camera had been found in about 40 minutes. Tecumseh raised a hand. We stopped. He crouched at the edge of the pressed-down circle and put his palm flat against the earth in the middle of it. He held it there for a long moment. Then he stood up and shook his head slightly and moved on. We reached the boulder with the partial footprint about 20 minutes later. At the boulder we split. Tecumseh and I stayed by the print. The Ridge brothers and Corntassel went ahead down the slope toward the point where the rivers met. Oconostota and Chickamauga went laterally along the ridge to the west, following what Tecumseh had identified during our afternoon planning as a probable travel corridor. Tecumseh sat down cross-legged in the leaves next to the print. He gestured for me to do the same. "I did," he said, very softly. "From now on, no talking. If I need to tell you something, I will touch your arm. If you need to tell me something, touch mine," he said. "If we hear it, do not turn your head fast. Turn slowly. And whatever you do, do not stand up quickly." I nodded. We sat. For a long time, nothing happened. The moon rose higher. The leaves stopped ticking against each other in the wind because the wind died down. The forest went into that deep, late-night stillness where you can hear a mouse cross a dry leaf 20 feet away. Then, from somewhere down the slope toward the river, I heard the first tap. It was one tap this time, a single wooden knock, like a stick against a tree trunk. It came from about 100 yards downhill and to my right. A minute passed. Then a second tap answered it, from somewhere to my left, higher up the slope. Also a single tap. Then a third, from directly ahead of us, down the slope. Tecumseh's hand touched my arm. He did not squeeze. He just rested his fingers on my sleeve. I understood the message. Do not move. We sat. The taps came more frequently after that. 2 here, 2 there. Then a series of what sounded like a stone knocked against another stone, sharp and high, close enough that I could feel it in my teeth. Then a long, low, drawn-out call that came from further away. A call that was neither owl nor coyote, nor any dog I have ever heard, and yet had elements of all three, ending in something that sounded almost like a word. Tecumseh's hand tightened on my arm. There was another call, closer. And then, from the ridge above us, so close that I felt the air move, the sound of an enormous body shifting its weight in the leaves. I did not turn my head. I turned my eyes. At the very edge of my peripheral vision, uphill and behind us, there was a shape between two trees. It was tall. It was upright. It was easily 8 feet at the shoulder, and above the shoulder there was a head that sat low on the neck the way the head of a very large ape sits, thrust forward. The moonlight was not strong enough to show me a face. I could see only the outline. The outline was of a thing that was not a bear and not a man, but had the general geometry of both at once. It was watching us. I do not know how long we sat there. Long enough for my legs to lose feeling. Long enough for my pulse to move down from a hammer in my throat to a steady, resigned drum in my ribs. Long enough for me to accept, in some deep, quiet part of myself, that I might not walk out of these woods. Then, from far down the slope, from where the Ridge Brothers and Corntassel had gone, a woman's voice began to sing. It was Corntassel. She was singing in a language I did not know. The song was slow and even, without a chorus, without a rhythm you could tap along to. It was more like a chant than a song. It rose and fell in a way that made my chest feel tight and my eyes sting, though nothing in the words was familiar to me, and nothing in the melody was one I could name. The shape uphill of us moved. It did not move toward us. It moved slightly, its head turning toward the direction of the song. I saw the outline of the head shift, and for a brief moment, before the head turned back, I thought I saw the glint of an eye. The song continued. Below us, further down the slope, other things began to move. I heard branches part. I heard bipedal footsteps in the leaves. I heard, and this is the part one still do not know what to do with, I heard a very quiet sound that could only be described as a low, resonant sob. Not from the shape uphill of us, from somewhere much further down, closer to the water. The song did not stop. Tecumseh finally moved. He turned his head slowly, so slowly that I could not see him turn, until his mouth was near my ear. He whispered a single word. He said, "Listen." I listened. There was more than one of them. There were at least 3 that I could count by sound. The one uphill of us, one somewhere ahead, near the ridge line, and the one below, near the water, that was making the sound that had, I still cannot say this without something in my chest tightening, that was making the sound of grief. Then, from somewhere off to the west, where Okonostata and Chickamauga had gone, there was a shout. It was Chickamauga's voice. He was calling out in his own language. I did not understand the words, but the tone was not the tone of a man in danger. It was the tone of a man who has decided to speak, and who has decided not to whisper. He called out 3 long phrases, evenly spaced. Then he stopped. The forest held its breath. Then the shape uphill of us stepped back. I felt more than saw the movement. The air changed. The pressure changed. The presence that had been directly above and behind us was no longer directly above and behind us. It had moved away. Tecumseh let out a very long, very slow breath. I did the same. We stayed there another 20 minutes. The song had faded. The sobbing sound down by the water had faded too. The taps had gone away. The forest was silent in the ordinary way that forests are silent at night. A mouse ran across the leaves nearby. An owl called once from very far off. Tecumseh finally stood. I stood with him. My legs almost buckled. He caught my elbow. We walked, very slowly, back the way we had come. We did not go straight to the camp. We went first to the meeting point where we were supposed to rendezvous with the other groups. The Ridge Brothers and Corntassel were there. Corntassel had a scratch on her cheek from a branch. She was pale, and her eyes were bright with something between tears and exhilaration, but she was intact. So were the brothers. Okonostata was there. Chickamauga was not, Okonostata said, in a voice that had aged 20 years in the last 4 hours, that Chickamauga had walked forward toward the sound of the sobbing, that he had told Oconostota to stay back and not to follow, that he had wanted to say the words his grandmother had taught him for a situation like this one, that he had walked past the point where Oconostota could still see him, and had spoken the 3 phrases we had all heard, and then had not come back. They had waited. They had waited a long time. They had not heard him again. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Tecumseh said, "We do not leave anyone up here. We are going to find him." Stand Watie stepped out of the trees behind us. None of us had heard him come, he said. "I saw him from the high line. I saw him walk down to the water. I saw him talking to something at the water, something very large. He was not fighting it. It was not fighting him." Then a mist came off the river. When the mist cleared, they were both gone. The Ridge brothers said something to each other in their language. Corntassel wrote something down in her notebook, and I saw her hand shake as she wrote. Yanagiska's voice came over the radio from the camp. He asked for our status, Tecumseh told him. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Yanagiska said, "Come back to camp. We will go up together at first light." We walked back down the ridge together. Nobody spoke. The forest was quiet, but it was the ordinary quiet of a forest at 3 in the morning. Whatever had been listening had gone. We went back up at first light. Yanagiska walked with us this time, leaning on a walking stick that he had cut fresh from a young hickory that morning. Junaliska stayed at the camp with the fire. We went slowly, out of respect for Yanagiska's knees and out of respect for what we were walking toward, which we did not yet understand. Stand Watie led us to the spot at the river where he had seen Chickamauga last. It was a small gravel bar on the Shenandoah side, where the water widened around a bend and slowed enough that a person could stand in it up to the knees without being pulled off balance. The gravel had been disturbed. There were prints on the bar and in the mud along the bank. There were the prints of a man in size 11 boots. There were also other prints. The other prints were enormous, and there were 2 sets of them, and they came out of the woods and stopped at the edge of the water and then went back into the woods, and they did not come out again as far as we could follow them. At the very edge of the water, half embedded in soft sand, where the current had lapped and receded during the night, there was one clear print facing the river, 19 inches long, 7 1/4 inches wide at the ball, the toes splayed, the arch deep. I cast that print with the kit from my pack. Corntassel photographed it while I worked. The Ridge brothers stood watch. Nobody spoke while the plaster set. While we waited, Yanagiska walked a small distance up the bank and stopped where the trees came right down to the water. He put his hand on the trunk of a river birch. He stood there for a long time, with his hand on the tree. When he came back, his eyes were wet, but he was steady. He said, "Chickamauga is not dead." I did not know how to answer that. Nobody asked him how he knew. Nobody needed to. He said, "But he is not coming back to us either. Not the way he was." Junaliska, when we got back to camp, listened to Yanagiska's account, and she nodded as if it confirmed something she had already suspected. She said, "Then we mourn him properly, and we let him choose. That is his choice to make." The 9 of them, or now the 8 of them, held a small ceremony in the camp that afternoon. Corntassel invited me to be present. I stood at the edge of the fire, and I did not speak and I did not sing, but I stood there for the 2 hours it took, and by the end of it I understood something I had not understood before, which was that grief and gratitude can be the same sound when they come from a deep enough place. Marcus Fitzgerald was never found. Neither was the young couple from Maryland Heights. The county closed the cases 8 months later as presumed lost. The wife of Marcus Fitzgerald sold the house and moved to Delaware. She still sends me a Christmas card each year with a photograph of Bishop, the golden retriever, who is now very old and mostly deaf. She has never asked me what really happened out there. I think she knows that if I could have told her, I would have. The 9, or the 8, packed up their camp the next day and drove away in 3 vehicles that were now carrying fewer bodies than they had brought in. Tecumseh shook my hand at the trailhead and told me they would come back if I needed them. Yanagiska told me to be gentle with myself and to sleep with a small fire nearby if the sleep did not come. Janaliska pressed a small pouch into my palm and closed my fingers around it and said, "When you need to know something the woods will not tell you, open this," and asked no questions of me in return. I still have the pouch. I have not opened it. I keep meaning to, and I do not. Corntassel gave me her card. It was a plain white card with a phone number and a name and nothing else. She said, "If the tapping comes back, call this number at any hour." I said I would. I have not needed to, not yet. Stand what he left before I could say goodbye. He walked out to the third truck, put his rifle case in the back, and got in the passenger side and closed the door. He did not look back at me. That is how he says goodbye. I understood. I put the cast in a cardboard box under my desk. I wrapped it in Chickamauga's flannel shirt, which one of the Ridge brothers had left behind, folded, on the passenger seat of my truck without saying a word about it. I think it was his way of leaving me a piece of what had happened. I have not worn the shirt. It is not mine to wear. The park stayed quiet after that. The pileated woodpeckers came back within a week. The tourists came back the following spring, and the thru-hikers came back that summer, and by the next October the trail was busy again with day hikers taking pictures of fungi and drinking wine at the point where the rivers meet. Nobody has gone missing along Loudon Heights in the years since. Nobody has reported hearing tapping in the trees. The K-9 team ran the trail again for training purposes 6 months later, and the dogs behaved normally. But every October, when the leaves turn, I go up the trail alone at dusk. I sit on the boulder where the print used to be. I do not bring a radio. I do not bring a flashlight. I bring the small pouch that Junaliska gave me, and I bring the piece of dried herbs that Corntassel gave me and that I have never lit, and I sit there until the moon rises through the bare branches. I have never heard the tapping again, but sometimes, in the deep quiet, I can feel the way the air changes when something very large stops moving somewhere on the ridge above me. It is not close. It is not looking for me. It is just there, watching the point where the rivers meet. And once, 3 autumns ago, when I was walking back down the trail in the last of the light, I saw something moving on the far bank of the Shenandoah, on the West Virginia side. It was tall. It was upright. It was moving slowly along the water, headed downstream, in no hurry at all. It was too far and too dim for me to see any face. But I stopped, and I stood still, and I raised one hand, and I held it up in the air for a long moment. The shape stopped moving. Then, so slowly that I might have imagined it, the shape raised one arm of its own. It held it up for the same length of time. Then it lowered it. Then it kept walking downstream, and the trees closed around it, and I did not see it again. I did not tell anyone about that. Not the sheriff, not the regional office, not Corntassel, whose card is still pinned to the corkboard above my desk. It felt like a private thing. It felt like something that had happened between me and someone I had once known and would not be seeing again in this life. I have thought a lot, in the years since, about what Chickamauga said when he walked forward toward the sound at the water. I have thought about the 3 phrases he called out. I have wondered whether they were a greeting, or a promise, or an apology, or something else that our languages do not have a word for. I asked Junaluska once, on the phone, 6 months after everything had happened. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in her soft voice, they were an offer to stay. I did not ask her anything else. I keep the cast under my desk. I keep the shirt around it. I keep the pouch in the top drawer. I keep the card on the corkboard. I keep going up the ridge every October, and I keep sitting on the boulder, and I keep listening. There is not always a moral to what happens in these woods. There is not always a resolution. Sometimes the story ends with a footprint in the sand at the edge of a river, and 8 people driving away in 3 trucks, and a 9th who chose the water. Sometimes the story ends with a raised hand across a wide river, and a hand raised in answer, and a promise nobody spoke out loud. If you have made it this far with me, thank you. This one was heavier than most. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who has walked in the woods and heard something they could not explain. And tell me, in the comments, what you would have done if you had been on that ridge with us. Would you have followed the sound at the water? Would you have stayed where you were? Would you have raised your hand at the shape on the far bank? I do not know the right answer. I only know what I did. I am still here. And so, somewhere, is the one who chose the water. The rivers keep moving. The forest keeps its secrets. And on the point where the two currents meet and do not entirely agree, the old sound continues under the newer ones, waiting for the next person who is quiet enough to hear it. Until next time, stay off the trails at night, turn off your speakers, and if you hear something knock twice on a tree in the woods around you, do not knock back. Some doors, once you answer them, do not close again. The evidence bag has been sitting on the corner of my desk for 11 days, and every morning I convince myself I will finally open it. Every evening I lock the office and leave it exactly where I found it, undisturbed, the seal intact, the label bearing coordinates written in handwriting that was not mine. The bag holds a single object, a cast of a footprint, poured in gray dental stone by someone who knew what they were doing. 17 inches from heel to toe, 6 inches at the widest point of the ball. The impression of a mid-tarsal break clear enough that I do not need a specialist to tell me what it means. I keep the bag because I am afraid of what will happen if I throw it away. I keep the bag because I am more afraid of what will happen if I show it to anyone else. I have worked the Blue Ridge Parkway for 19 years. My duty station is milepost 344, near the Craggy Gardens overlook, and my patrol covers a stretch of ridgeline that runs through some of the loneliest high country left in the eastern United States. I know every pullout, every service road, every closed gate between here and Water Rock Knob. I know which switchbacks fill with fog at 3 in the afternoon, and which meadows hold snow into April. What I did not know, until this summer, was that the ridgeline knew me too, that it had been watching, that it had been waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The cast came from a place called Farron Knob, off an unmarked spur that branches from a maintenance road most drivers pass without ever seeing. A visitor had reported seeing a bear behaving strangely near the tree line. I drove up expecting nothing more than a food-conditioned yearling. What I found was a stretch of soft loam between two hemlocks where something enormous had knelt and pressed its full weight into the ground. Not a bear, not a person, something in between, and larger than either. I photographed the impression. I marked the coordinates. Then I did the thing I was trained never to do. I poured the cast myself, sealed it in the bag, drove back to the station and told no one. That evening I sat in my truck at the craggy overlook and watched the sun bleed out behind the Black Mountains. The valley below filled with a soft blue haze that the old-timers around here call smoke of the ridge. It is beautiful. It is also, on certain nights, a kind of curtain. You cannot see through it. You cannot tell what is coming up out of the cove until it is already at the guardrail. I sat there until the last car had gone, until the parkway was mine again, and I told myself I would drive home and sleep and think about the cast in the morning. Instead, I stayed. I stayed because I could hear something moving down in the laurel hells below the overlook, and it was moving on 2 feet, and it was not in any hurry to leave. If you find yourself watching this and feeling that particular prickle at the back of the neck, the one that tells you the story is close to something true, do me a favor before you go any further. Tap the like, drop a word in the comments about the last place you felt watched in the woods, and subscribe if you want to stay with me through the rest of this. The parkway is long, and I have a great deal more to say. I did not sleep that night. I did not sleep the next night either. On the third morning, I opened the incident log and searched backward through the past decade for anything that resembled what I had seen. I found 7 reports. Every one of them had been filed by a ranger who no longer worked the parkway. Every one of them had been reviewed by a supervisor and reclassified as either bear activity, hoax, or misidentification. Every one of them had been filed within a 3-mile radius of Farron Knob. Someone had been quietly containing these reports for a very long time. Someone had decided that the ridge was going to keep its secrets, and I had just poured a cast that broke the seal. The call came on the 11th day. It came on the office landline, which almost never rings, and the voice on the other end was calm, careful, and unfamiliar. He said his name was Little Wolf, and he was driving in from Montana with a small group of people from the Northern Cheyenne community at Lame Deer. He said someone at the tribal office had received a letter from a former Parkway employee. a woman who had retired 8 years ago, and the letter had mentioned the ridge above Craggy by name. He said the group had left the reservation 4 days earlier and expected to reach Asheville by nightfall. He asked whether I would be willing to meet with them at the Overlook the next morning. He said they were bringing an elder who had walked this same ridge as a young man in 1971 and who had not spoken about it since. He said the elder was ready now. He said the elder had asked to speak to whichever ranger had disturbed the ground. I told him I would be there. I hung up the phone. I looked at the evidence bag on the corner of my desk, and for the first time in 11 days I understood that I was not the one who had found the print. The print had found me. The morning came in with a low ceiling of cloud that turned the ridgeline into a gray corridor with no visible ends. I arrived at the Craggy Gardens Overlook at 6:30, half an hour early, and found a single vehicle already parked at the far end of the lot, a blue Ford Expedition with Montana plates. The rear windows were fogged from the breath of the people inside. I parked at a respectful distance and stepped out into the cold air and waited to be seen. 3 men emerged first. The tallest was a man in his late 50s who introduced himself as Little Wolf. He shook my hand with a grip that had been shaped by decades of physical work, and his eyes did not leave my face until he had taken the measure of me. Beside him stood a broader man in his 40s, quieter, with a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down into his beard. He introduced himself as 2 Moons and offered nothing else. Behind them came a younger man, perhaps 30, wiry, with a leather satchel slung across his chest that he handled with the care of someone carrying something fragile. His name was Porcupine, and when he spoke his English carried the flat and gentle cadence of the northern plains. Then the passenger door of the Expedition opened, and an elder stepped down. He moved slowly, one hand on the doorframe, the other on a walking stick carved from lightning-struck ash. His hair was white and long and gathered at the back of his neck with a strip of red cloth. His eyes, when they found mine, were the pale silver blue of a winter sky. Little Wolf said, "This is Black Kettle. He is our uncle. He has come a long way to speak with you." I have met many people in my career whose presence changed the temperature of a room. Black Kettle changed the temperature of the Overlook. The wind that had been sliding along the guardrail seemed to slow. The birds in the balsam firs behind us went silent. He walked toward me with a steadiness that seemed to belong to a much younger man, and when he reached me he did not offer his hand. Instead he lifted his palm and held it, open, at the height of my chest, and waited. I mirrored the gesture without knowing why. He looked at my hand for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and lowered his palm. "You have touched the ground where he knelt," he said. His voice was soft and unhurried. His English was formal in the way of a man who had learned it late and used it precisely. I said yes, he said. "Then we will need to walk, but first we will need to sit and eat and be honest with one another. There is no shortcut for what has to happen next." 2 more vehicles arrived over the next hour. A silver pickup with a woman driving, a woman in her 60s whom Little Wolf introduced as Morning Star. She was a tribal historian, he said, and she had brought files. She was accompanied by a slender man in a wide-brimmed hat who introduced himself as Roman Nose, and who did not speak again for the rest of the morning, but who watched everything and everyone with a stillness that reminded me of a heron in shallow water. Behind them came a smaller SUV, carrying 3 more people. A man named Dull Knife, gray at the temples, who wore a fire department windbreaker from a town I had never heard of. A woman named White Antelope, small and sharp-featured, who greeted me with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. And a heavy-set man named Warbonnet, who set down a hard-sided cooler at his feet and asked whether there was somewhere private we could gather. I led them to the picnic shelter at the north end of the Overlook. The parkway would not open to visitors for another 20 minutes. Warbonnet opened the cooler and produced dried meat, 3 loaves of bread, and a thermos of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Morning Star spread a stack of file folders across the picnic table. Little Wolf sat beside Black Kettle. The others took places along the benches without a word, as if the seating had been decided long before they arrived. Whirlwind arrived last. He came on foot, up the closed maintenance road on the west side of the Overlook, and I did not see him until he was already at the edge of the shelter. He was a thin man with a graying braid and a rifle slung across his back inside a canvas case. And when Little Wolf saw him, he stood and embraced him without a word. Whirlwind nodded at me. He said, "Sorry for the way I come in. I do not like parking lots. I like to see the country on my own feet first." I had, at that point, 30 years of federal service between me and retirement. I had led search and rescue teams. I had testified in court. I had spoken at 3 Ranger Academy graduations. I had never in my life felt so completely like a guest at a table that had been set for a purpose I did not yet understand. Morningstar opened the first folder. She said, "We are going to show you some things now, and we are going to tell you some things, and none of it is going to be easy. Before we begin, we would like you to know that we did not come here to frighten you. We came because you crossed a line that has been quiet for a very long time, and we are the ones who owe you an explanation, not the other way around." Black Kettle set his hand flat on the tabletop. He said, "Tell him the name we do not say. Tell him it now, so we do not have to say it again." Morningstar looked at me. She said, "In the language of our elders, the being is called by a name I will not use here, because using it invites its attention. In your language, the closest word is a word you already know." She paused. She said, "When you found the print, you were not looking at an animal. You were looking at a person. He is not human. He is not spirit. He is the third kind. And he has been walking this ridge for longer than either of our people have kept records." I asked, "Why is he here?" Whirlwind, who had been standing at the edge of the shelter, spoke for the first time. He said, "Because someone brought him, and because no one has come to take him back." We drove in 3 vehicles down to the maintenance gate at the base of the Farron Knob Spur. I rode with Black Kettle and Little Wolf in the lead truck. The elder was quiet for the first mile, watching the rhododendron close in on either side of the road, his hand resting on the head of the walking stick. When he finally spoke, his voice was even softer than before. "You will hear things today that will not fit inside the shape of what you thought you knew. I ask only that you listen the way you would listen to a stream you had not heard before. Do not try to name every sound. Let them arrive." I told him I would try. I meant it. The Farron Knob Spur is not on any parkway map available to the public. It was cut in 1935 as a construction access route, and it was closed and gated in 1952 after a series of accidents involving grading equipment that no one could ever explain to the satisfaction of the superintendent. There are 2 versions of the story in the Ranger break room. The official version says that the roadbed was unstable and that the grading crews were operating beyond safe tolerances. The unofficial version, told only after several cups of coffee, says that 3 men vanished from that roadbed in a single week in the summer of '51, and that no bodies were ever found, and that the last thing anyone heard on the radio from the foreman that Friday morning was the sound of a full-grown man trying not to cry. Morningstar had brought the incident logs, real ones, not the sanitized versions kept in the Parkway archive. She had them because her aunt had married a man who worked as a paving contractor on the Parkway in 1951, and the man had kept his own notebook, and the notebook had come down to her when he passed. She had photocopies of every page. She spread them on the hood of Little Wolf's truck when we reached the gate. Then she stepped back and let me read. The notebook told a story that no Parkway document I had ever seen would ever tell. It described a summer in which men who worked the Farron Knob Spur reported being watched from the tree line. It described tools disappearing from open toolboxes and reappearing, arranged in patterns, on rocks a half-mile up the mountain. It described the sound of stones being clacked together at night. It described, in the entry for July 18th, a face that appeared in the driver's side window of a road grader at dawn, a face that was pressed against the glass from the outside and that did not draw back when the driver screamed. The face, the notebook said, had eyes set too far apart and skin the color of wet river clay, and it did not blink for the entire 2 minutes that the driver stared at it before it turned and walked back into the trees on legs that bent at all the correct joints and moved at a speed no man could match. I read the entry twice. I set the copy down. Little Wolf was watching me. He said, "Do you believe him?" I said, "I believe he wrote what he saw." Black Kettle nodded, as if a small question had been answered. We opened the gate. We drove up the old grade at a walking pace. The maintenance road climbs almost 800 feet in a mile and a half, and the switchbacks are so tight that the rear axle of the pickup groaned on each one. On either side the forest closed in, chestnut oak, mountain laurel, and beneath them a floor of galax and moss that had not been disturbed in decades. Halfway up, at a small pull-off where the crew of 1935 had once parked their machinery, Whirlwind asked us to stop. He got out. He walked the perimeter of the pull-off in a slow counterclockwise circle, his head slightly bowed, his lips moving. He touched 3 trees in sequence, always the same 3, though I could not tell what distinguished them from any of the others. When he came back to the truck, he said, "He came through here 2 nights ago. He was moving north. He was not alone." I asked him how he knew. He looked at me with a patience I did not deserve. He said, "I know because I have been walking in the country he uses for 40 years. I know because my grandfather taught me the shape of his stride. I know because the moss at the base of the 3rd tree is bruised where his shoulder rested when he stopped to listen. He was listening for the same thing we are listening for, and whatever it was, it made him move on." We drove the rest of the way to the summit clearing where I had made the cast. When we arrived, I stepped down from the truck first and walked ahead to check that the site was still as I had left it. It was not. The impression had been widened, not by weather, not by an animal. Someone or something had knelt in the same spot again, and the second knee print was fresh, no more than 24 hours old. Beside it, arranged in a neat and deliberate line, were 3 river stones. They had not been there when I made the cast. They had not been there yesterday afternoon when I drove past the base of the spur. They were smooth and gray, and each one was the size of a chicken egg, and they had been placed with the care of a person setting out an offering. Behind me I heard Morning Star draw in her breath. Black Kettle stepped past me. He walked to the stones. He knelt with a slowness that suggested pain, and he studied them for a long time without touching them. Then he raised his eyes to the tree line. He said, in a voice that carried across the clearing without ever rising above a murmur, "We hear you. We have come. You do not need to leave more signs for us today." The wind shifted. The balsam firs on the far side of the clearing bent in a single, slow motion, as if a hand had passed over their tops. And then, faintly, from somewhere on the ridge above us, came the sound of 2 stones being knocked together. Once, twice, 3 times. A pause, and then the same 3 knocks, softer, farther away. 2 moons, who had not spoken since we arrived, said quietly, "He is answering." We did not go up the ridge that afternoon. Black Kettle said the light was wrong and the ground was not yet ready, and that we would return before dawn. We drove back down the old grade in a silence that felt like the silence after a funeral, rather than the silence before one. When we reached the overlook, Little Wolf asked whether the parkway had any lodging that could accommodate the group for the night. I told him that the ranger residences at Craggy included a spare bunkhouse used by seasonal staff, and that it was empty for the week. I offered it. He accepted with a nod that carried more gratitude than the offer deserved. That evening we ate together at the picnic shelter. Warbonnet grilled venison sausages that he had brought from a smokehouse in Ashland, Montana. Morning Star had brought fry bread wrapped in butcher paper. Porcupine produced a jar of huckleberry preserves from his satchel and passed it around without ceremony. We ate. We spoke about small things. Little Wolf asked about my family. I told him about my wife, who worked as a nurse in Asheville, and about my daughter, who had graduated the previous spring from the forestry program at Warren Wilson College. He listened with the attention of a man who understood that when a person is about to be asked something difficult, he first needs to be reminded of what he loves. After the plates had been cleared, Black Kettle asked me to sit beside him at the far end of the table. The others gave us space. He set his walking stick across his lap. He said, "I am going to tell you what I saw in 1971, so that you understand who we are speaking of. I ask that you not interrupt. When I am done, you may ask what you wish." He spoke for the better part of an hour. I will not repeat all of it. Some of what he said was not mine to carry, but the shape of the story was this. In the summer of 1971, Black Kettle had come east as a young man of 22, sent by his grandmother to speak with an elder from the eastern band of Cherokee, who was said to have knowledge that had passed out of the Cheyenne with the deaths of certain keepers in the previous decade. The elder had lived in a cabin on the North Carolina side of the ridge, in a hollow that no longer appears on modern maps because the parkway had rerouted the road around it in the mid-1980s. Black Kettle had stayed with the elder for 9 weeks. During those 9 weeks he had been taken, twice, to a place high on the ridge where the elder said a person of the third kind had lived for as long as anyone remembered. The person, the elder said, had not been born there. The person had been brought there long ago by men who did not understand what they were carrying and who had abandoned him when they realized what he was. Black Kettle had seen him, not clearly, not for long, but he had seen him at a distance of perhaps 30 yards, standing very still at the edge of a small meadow, and the shape of him had been the shape of a man taller than any man Black Kettle had ever met, and the color of him had been the color of the moss on the north side of a hemlock, and the face of him had been the face of something that had once been a person and was now something else, and the eyes of him had been the eyes of a creature that had been alone for a length of time no human mind was built to hold. The elder had told Black Kettle that the person of the third kind was not dangerous unless the country around him was made unwell. He said that so long as the ridge was quiet and the streams were clean and no one dug too deep and no one built too tall, the person would keep to his own paths and would not cross ours. But if the country was made unwell, the elder said, the person would begin to walk in daylight. He would begin to leave signs. He would begin to test whether anyone was left who remembered how to speak with him. And if no one came, the elder said, then the person would eventually stop testing. And when he stopped testing, he would begin to take. The parkway, Black Kettle said, had been quiet for a long time. Then it had not. I asked him what had changed. He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You tell me. You work here. You see the maps. You see the numbers. You see the trucks that come at night through the gates that used to be closed. Tell me what has changed on this ridge in the last 3 years." I did not answer him right away. I did not answer him because the answer was already in my mouth, and I did not want to say it. 3 years ago, the Parkway had entered a memorandum of agreement with a private company to allow limited exploratory drilling on a parcel of land adjacent to the Farron Knob Spur. The land was not technically Parkway land. It was a private inholding that had been surrounded by Parkway boundary in the 1950s. The owners had, for reasons that were never fully explained to those of us at the district level, decided to allow a mineral survey. The survey had involved trucks, generators, small crews, nighttime work, because the days were too hot for the equipment. It had continued for 11 months and had ended, without public announcement, on a Tuesday morning last October. The rumor among the maintenance crews was that the survey team had left in a hurry. The rumor was that one of the surveyors had come down the mountain on foot at 3 in the morning, without his boots, without his hat, and without the ability to speak in complete sentences for the better part of a week. I told Black Kettle what I knew. He listened without changing expression. When I was done, he said, "Then the person has been made unwell along with the country, and he has stopped testing. And what he did to that surveyor was the beginning. And what he is preparing to do now will be the end, unless we can reach him before he crosses the line he has been holding." He looked at me. He said, "We cannot do this without a person who belongs to this ridge. You belong to this ridge. That is why we came for you." Before I forget, if the story has held your attention this far, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps the channel more than you might imagine, and it lets the algorithm know that stories like this one deserve to be found by other people who love the quiet corners of the country. Leave a comment when you get the chance. Tell me the name of a place you have felt something in the trees that you never spoke about aloud. And if you have not yet subscribed, do that now so you can walk with me through the last of what happened on that ridge. I told Black Kettle I would go with them. I told him I did not know what I could offer. He said, "You will offer the fact that you are willing to go." That is all he has waited for. We left the bunkhouse at 4 in the morning. The stars were still visible above the ridge, hard and clean in the cold air, and the temperature at the overlook was somewhere near 40 degrees. We took 2 vehicles up the old grade. Little Wolf drove the first, with Black Kettle beside him and Morning Star in the back seat with a canvas bundle across her knees. I drove the second, with Whirlwind, 2 Moons, and Porcupine, Roman nose, white antelope, dull knife, and war bonnet remained at the overlook. Their task, Little Wolf had told me the night before, was to keep the parkway closed to the public at both ends of the district for as long as we were on the ridge. He did not explain how they intended to do this. I did not ask. The old grade was silent. Not the ordinary silence of a mountain road before sunrise. The kind of silence you notice because your ears keep trying to find something to fasten to and cannot. No owls, no wind. The engine of my pickup was the only sound in a landscape that had been made to hold its breath. When we reached the pull-off where Whirlwind had touched the 3 trees, he asked me to shut the engine off. We coasted the last quarter-mile to the summit, clearing under gravity alone. Black Kettle stepped down from Little Wolf's truck. He walked ahead of us into the clearing and stood at the center of it, near the impression I had cast a week and a half earlier. Morning Star followed with a canvas bundle. She unrolled it on a flat stone at the edge of the clearing and revealed a series of objects that had been prepared long before this trip. A small clay bowl, a bundle of dried sage tied with red thread, a folded piece of cloth the color of ochre, a carved wooden figure no larger than my thumb, the details of which I could not see clearly in the half-light, and a small copper bell suspended from a length of rawhide. Whirlwind opened the canvas case that held his rifle. He did not remove the rifle. He set the case on the ground beside the flat stone and left it closed. He said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "The rifle is not for him. It is for anything else that might come while we are not looking. I want you to know that, in case it matters later." 2 moons and porcupine took positions at the edges of the clearing, one to the north and one to the south. They did not speak. They watched the tree line. Little Wolf and I stood behind Black Kettle at a distance he had specified with a small gesture of his hand. Morning Star stood beside the flat stone. Black Kettle raised his walking stick. He spoke in a language I did not understand. His voice was low and steady, and it filled the clearing without ever rising above the level of ordinary speech. He spoke for perhaps 4 minutes. He paused. He spoke again. He paused. He rang the copper bell, once, a small clean sound that carried farther than it should have, and then he waited. For a long time nothing happened. The gloom above the ridge began to soften into the first pale gray of morning. The tops of the balsam firs on the far side of the clearing gradually became visible against the sky. I could smell the sage where Morning Star had lit it in the clay bowl, a thin thread of smoke rising straight up in air so still it might have been water. Then, from the tree line on the north side of the clearing, came the sound of a footstep. It was not the crack of a broken branch. It was not the shuffle of a deer. It was the sound of a heavy body setting a foot down on the earth with the care of a person who does not wish to be heard, and who has failed only by a small margin. It was followed by a second footstep, and then by silence. Black Kettle did not turn. He kept his eyes on the far side of the clearing where the sound had come from. He spoke again in his language, slower now, gentler, in the cadence one might use with a frightened child or a wounded animal. Something moved between the trees. I want to be careful, now, about what I say. I did not see him clearly. I saw a shape at the edge of the tree line that was tall enough that its head was above the lowest branches of the firs, which meant it was at least 8 feet in height. I saw a suggestion of shoulders. I saw an outline where the gloom of the forest gave way to something denser, something that had weight and mass and a stillness that was the stillness of a living thing rather than a stone. I did not see the face. I do not want to see the face. I do not think I would be sitting here recording this if I had seen the face clearly. But I heard him breathe, and I will carry that sound for the rest of my life. It was not the breath of an animal. It was slow, deliberate, long inhalations that seemed to draw the air out of the clearing itself, followed by exhalations that were almost sighs. There was a knowingness in them. There was patience. There was, and this is the part one have not been able to explain to anyone, there was grief. He was breathing in the way a person breathes when he has waited a long time to be spoken to and does not yet trust that the speaking will continue. Black Kettle held out both of his hands, palms up. He said something in his language that included, I later learned, an apology. Morning Star, without looking away from the tree line, reached down and rang the copper bell a second time. The shape at the tree line lowered itself. Not away, down, It knelt, the way a very tall man might kneel before an altar. And in the growing light I saw, for the briefest fraction of a second, the outline of a face turned toward Black Kettle. I saw the reflection of the pale gray of the sky in what I can only call eyes. And then the shape rose, and turned, and stepped back into the trees, and was gone. The clearing held its silence for perhaps 30 seconds after he left. Then, from somewhere far up the ridge, higher than the summit clearing, higher than I would have thought any living thing could reach in that time, came the sound of 2 stones being knocked together. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 more. Black Kettle lowered his hands. He said, in English, he has agreed to speak with us tonight. At the place he chose. It will not be here. It will be the circle of stones above the north face. We have work to do before then. I turned to look at Whirlwind. He was already picking up the canvas case. The rest of that day passed in preparations I did not fully understand and that I did not ask to have explained. Morning Star and Porcupine drove down to Asheville to collect supplies from a store I had never heard of on a side street off Haywood Road. Little Wolf and Whirlwind hiked a mile north of the summit clearing to a place they referred to only as the Old Circle, and returned in the afternoon with the report that the site was intact and had not been disturbed. 2 Moons stayed with Black Kettle in the picnic shelter, and the 2 of them spoke quietly for hours, sometimes in English, more often in a language that seemed to belong to the shape of the wind itself. At the overlook, Roman Nose and White Antelope had done what they had promised. The parkway had been closed at milepost 340 and milepost 355. A sign at each closure indicated a maintenance issue with a bridge that did not exist. No one questioned it. Rangers from adjacent districts phoned me twice to confirm the closure. I confirmed it. Dull Knife and Warbonnet spent the day working through the incident logs with Morning Star's photocopies open on the table beside them, cross-referencing dates and coordinates in a way that made me realize they were both retired law enforcement of some kind. No one had told me that. No one needed to. We left for the Circle of Stones at sunset. Black Kettle rode again in Little Wolf's truck. I drove Whirlwind, Porcupine, and 2 Moons. Morning Star and the others followed in the 2 remaining vehicles as far as the summit clearing, and then set up a base there, a fire in a small pit that Whirlwind had built earlier in the day, and a perimeter that I did not see them mark but that I understood, in a way I could not have explained, was there. The Circle of Stones was not on any map. It sat on a shoulder of the ridge about 300 vertical feet above the summit clearing, in a small natural amphitheater ringed by ancient balsam firs that must have been 300 years old at their base. In the center of the amphitheater, arranged in a rough oval, were 9 standing stones. None was taller than my waist. None was smaller than my forearm. Each was set upright in the earth with the patient care of a builder who had understood that this work would outlive him by centuries. Whirlwind said, quietly, "This is not our people's work, nor the work of the people who were here before us. This is older than either of us, and we do not know who set the stones. We know only that we have been asked to keep them clean." We waited for him at the center of the circle. He came at full night. He came without sound. There was no footstep to warn us this time. There was only the sudden knowledge that he was there, standing at the far edge of the amphitheater, tall against the outline of the firs, and looking at us with the pale eyes that had already stopped my breath once that morning. Black Kettle spoke to him for the better part of 2 hours. I did not understand the words. I did not need to. The cadence was that of one old friend to another, one who has come a long way to apologize, and who does not wish to be forgiven too quickly. He named things. He named the surveyors. He named the trucks. He named the men who had opened the ground where the ground was never meant to be opened. He listed the harms in a slow and careful voice, and at each harm he paused, and the shape at the far edge of the amphitheater inclined its head, and after a time the shape began to speak back. I say speak. I do not mean words. He made a sound low in his chest that resembled words the way distant thunder resembles a spoken sentence. It rose and fell. It had shape. It had meaning that I could feel without being able to parse. Black Kettle listened, he answered. He listened again. Once he asked me to step forward and stand beside him. I did, he said, in English, so that the person at the edge of the amphitheater could hear his tone, even if he could not understand his language. This is the one who found the print. This is the one who kept the print in a locked room and did not sell it. This is the one who called us when he could have called others. He is a keeper here now. Do you accept him?" The shape at the far edge of the amphitheater looked at me. I felt his attention the way you feel the weight of a hand placed gently on the top of your head. It was not hostile. It was not warm. It was the attention of something that had been asked a question of enormous importance and was taking the time to answer it correctly. He inclined his head. He made a single low sound. Black Kettle nodded and said, quietly, "Thank you." The rest of the conversation I will not describe in detail. Some of it was about the surveyors. Some of it was about promises the Parkway would need to make. Promises that would be kept by people like Little Wolf and Morning Star, and by others whose names I did not yet know. Some of it was about the stones in the circle, and how they were to be tended, and who would be responsible now that Black Kettle was old and his grandmother's people had few young keepers left. And some of it was about me. I was told that the ridge above Craggy was not, and had never been, only a park. I was told that certain places had been given to the keeping of certain peoples long before the Parkway had been surveyed, and that the paperwork of my government did not alter the shape of that giving. I was told that I could continue in my duties, but that certain areas of my patrol were now to be understood differently, and that certain reports were now to be filed with 2 sets of eyes rather than 1. I agreed to all of it. I would have agreed to more. Before he left, the person at the edge of the amphitheater raised one long arm and pointed, deliberately, back down the ridge in the direction of the summit clearing. Black Kettle turned to look. Then he turned back. He said, "He says the surveyor who came down the mountain last October did not tell anyone the whole story. He says the surveyor took something with him that was not his to take. He says it will need to be returned. He looked at me. He said, 'We will need your help to find it, but not tonight. Tonight we go home.'" The shape stepped back into the trees. He did not turn. He did not run. He simply receded, one step, and then another, and then he was no longer among us. The amphitheater held its stillness. The firs did not move. We walked back down to the summit clearing in a silence that felt, this time, like the silence of a chapel after a service that has ended well. At the fire pit, Morning Star handed me a small copper bell on a length of rawhide. She said, "This one is yours now," she said. "When you feel him near, ring it once. He will know that you heard him. He will not come closer. He will not need to." I have carried the bell in my truck ever since. I have rung it twice, both times at a moment I will not describe, on a stretch of the Parkway I will not name, on a night when the smoke of the ridge was low in the coves and the wind was moving against itself. Both times, I felt something at the edge of my headlights slow, incline its head, and step back into the trees. The evidence bag is no longer on my desk. Morning Star took the cast with her when the delegation left. She said it belonged with the people who could keep it properly. She said the Parkway had held it long enough. I did not argue. I still work milepost 344. I still drive the switchbacks. I still watch the valley fill with blue haze at the end of every day. But I do not walk alone on the ridge above Farron Knob anymore. I do not need to. There are others walking there now. And when I see a print in the soft loam between 2 hemlocks, I do not photograph it. I do not pour a cast. I nod at the tree line. I ring the small copper bell, once, softly, and I keep moving. Some places, I have come to understand, were never meant to be understood by only one people. Some places were meant to be shared. And some presences on this Parkway have been waiting, patiently, for the people they trust to come back and speak with them again. My part in this story is small, but it is mine, and it is enough, and I will keep it until the day comes for me to hand it on. If you have walked with me all the way to the end of this one, I want to say thank you, truly. Stories like this depend on listeners who do not look away. When you have a moment, please take the time to hit the like button, share the video with someone who understands why quiet places matter, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you are new here, subscribe so that you can be with me for the next patrol. There are more stretches of this Parkway I have not yet told you about, and there are more presences in more corners of this country that are waiting to be met with the respect they were owed a long time ago. Until then, keep to the marked trails. Watch the tree line. And if the wind moves against itself on a still evening, do not be afraid. Nod at it. Ring your own small bell, whatever shape it takes, and walk on. Quahati Parker did not sleep on the first night we made camp below the boulder field. I know this because I did not sleep either, and every time I opened my eyes and looked across the fire, he was sitting exactly where he had sat when the last of the coals had gone red, his gray braids resting on the shoulders of a canvas coat that was older than either of us, his eyes fixed on the black wall of trees that climbed toward the summit of Old Rag Mountain. He was 73 years old. He had driven 3 days from Comanche County, Oklahoma, to be here. He was the oldest son of a line that traced itself back through Peta-Nocona and further still, back into the country of long grass and buffalo bones. And he had brought 9 of his people with him because of a story that he did not want to tell in daylight. I had been carrying a green and gray uniform for 19 years by then. When the request had come down through the district office 2 weeks earlier, it had come with a note from the superintendent that read only, "Take this seriously, and do not put it on the schedule board." That was how I knew, before I had even met Parker at the ranger station in Sperryville, that the 10 people driving in from Oklahoma were not a normal permit application. They had come to hunt something. They had not called it hunting. They had called it answering a call that was made a long time ago, and Parker had said those words on the phone with the same steady, unhurried voice that I had heard from other men who had spent their lives working close to things that could kill them. Now the fire was almost out. The wind was moving high up in the oaks, but down here in the hollow it was still, and the granite bulk of Old Rag Mountain sat above us like a sleeping shape whose breathing you could almost hear if you listened long enough. Peta-Nocona lay wrapped in a wool blanket a few paces from his father, one arm across his eyes. He was in his 40s, thick through the shoulders, a heavy jaw shadowed with 2 days of black stubble. He had spent 20 years working the oil fields down in Texas before coming home, and he moved like a man who had learned early not to waste a step. He had not said more than 11 words to me since we had met at the trailhead that afternoon. Buffalo Hump was awake. He was crouched near the edge of the small clearing, his back turned to the fire, his palm flat on the earth. He was reading the ground the way I read the logbooks at the station, patient and careful, letting his hand pick up what his eyes could not see in this low light. He was the tracker of the group. Parker had introduced him as such and had said nothing else, which had told me that Buffalo Hump was, in Parker's estimation, the most important person present besides Parker himself. I sat with my back against the smooth trunk of a beech tree and let my radio rest against my hip. I had turned the volume all the way down, not off. I still wanted to hear it if the dispatcher tried to reach me, but I did not want it to speak on its own tonight. I had learned, over the years, that certain nights on this mountain did not tolerate uninvited noise. The mountain we were on is called Old Rag by the people who live in the small towns around its base. It rises 3,284 feet above the valley floor, in the northern reach of the Blue Ridge, inside the boundary of Shenandoah National Park. Its summit is famous for a stretch of pale gray granite boulders the size of small houses, stacked and split and tilted at angles that suggest a slow and enormous violence a very long time ago. In the daytime, it is one of the most heavily traveled hikes in Virginia. In the summer, on a Saturday, you can stand at the parking area at 7 in the morning and watch 200 cars work their way in. But it was late in October now. The last long weekend of the season had passed. The upper trails had been closed for what the park called resource protection. The lower trails were open only by permit. The maple leaves had turned and were falling, and the ridge above us was already touched with a hard frost that came earlier here than most people expected. We had come in through Weekly Hollow. Parker had chosen the route. He had wanted to approach from the north along the old fire road, and to make our first camp low, in a stand of hemlocks that stood beside a creek whose name I do not think I can spell correctly. The creek ran cold and steady over a bed of quiet stone. I had drunk from it 3 times that afternoon, and had felt the water sit heavy in my chest. I glanced across at Ishatai. He was the youngest of the elders, maybe 50 years old, sharp-featured, quiet, with a long braid the color of iron. He was sitting cross-legged on the far side of the fire pit, and his eyes were closed, but the muscles at the corners of his mouth were moving very slightly, as if he were speaking with someone I could not hear. Parker had said, when he introduced him, "Ishitai listens. When Ishitai has something to say, we all stop and hear him." I had nodded as if I understood, and I had thought about how, in the language of my grandmother, we would have called what Ishitai did a very old word that we did not use aloud anymore. Tabananica had already gone into his tent. He was the doubter. Every group has one. Parker had brought him deliberately, I thought. He was younger, in his 30s, a heavy man with a wide, flat face and an easy laugh, and he had spent the drive out arguing with everyone else about whether they were going to find anything at all. His skepticism did not seem to bother the others. It seemed, if anything, to reassure them, as if the presence of a man who was ready to be wrong would keep the rest of them honest. I could hear Yamparika snoring, low and even, from the second of the 3 tents. Somewhere out beyond the ring of firelight, a branch broke. It was not a loud break. It was the kind of small, dry snap you might make if you stepped on a twig by accident. It was very close. Every one of us moved at the same moment. Buffalo Hump lifted his hand off the ground. Parker turned his head. Ishitai opened his eyes. Peta Nokona sat up under his blanket. I felt my own hand travel to the holster on my hip without my having decided to send it there. The sound did not repeat. We waited. The wind up in the oaks kept moving. The creek kept running. The coals popped once. A minute passed, 2. Buffalo Hump stood up, slowly, and stepped toward the deeper line of trees. He did not go far. He stopped where the firelight ended and where the trunks began, and he stood there for a long time, his head cocked slightly, listening in a way that made the rest of us listen with him. When he came back, he did not sit down. He looked at Parker. He said, in a voice low enough that I only barely caught the words, "It walked past us. It stopped. It went on." Parker nodded once, as if this was information he had been expecting. He did not turn to me, but he spoke to me. He said, "Ranger, tomorrow, at first light, we will move up to the second camp. Sleep now, if you can." I did not sleep. Morning came slow and gray. The frost had settled thick in the low places, and the leaves under the hemlocks were rimmed white and brittle. I woke to the sound of a metal cup being set on a flat stone. Coetti had made coffee. He was the youngest of the party, 22, with a smooth brown face and eyes that were too tired for his age. He handed me a cup without speaking, and I took it and let it warm my hands before I drank. Coetti had insisted on coming. Parker had told me this the night before, in one of the few pieces of context he had shared. Coetti was the son of a woman who had died the previous spring. She had been Parker's niece by his second marriage, and she had, in the last 3 years of her life, become deeply interested in the story that had brought us here. She had researched it. She had traveled to speak with people. She had collected accounts. Coetti was carrying his mother's notebook in the top pocket of his jacket, and every time he sat down he touched the pocket with the flat of his hand, as if to check that the book was still there. Wanderer was already up and out. He had gone ahead at 3 in the morning, according to Parker, to scout the fire road. He was the group's forward eyes, a lean and quiet man of about 40, who spoke less than Peta Nokona and moved with a kind of settled patience that reminded me of the older deer that live long enough to learn where the hunters do not go. I watched Parker check his watch twice as we broke camp, and I understood that Parker was thinking about Wanderer. We loaded the packs. We put out the fire and covered the ash with earth and rolled a stone over it. Nokoni took a long look at the spot where the branch had broken the night before and said something quiet in a language I did not know. Then he lifted his rifle and slung it over his shoulder. Nokoni's rifle was old. It was a Winchester lever action of a pattern that had not been made in 100 years. He carried it, Parker had told me at the trailhead, because his grandfather had carried it, and his grandfather's father before him. And it had once been fired at the exact kind of thing we were now going to try to find. I had not asked whether Nokoni's rifle was loaded. I had assumed that it was. I had also assumed, from the way Nokoni handled it, that if I ever asked him to unload it, he would refuse politely and continue about his business. We went up the fire road in single file. Parker walked at the front, then Buffalo Hump, then Ishitai, then me, then Patanokona, then Yamparika, then Tabananica, then Coeti, then Quinai at the rear. Nokoni ranged between us. He was the connecting piece of the line, moving forward and back, checking behind and ahead, watching the flanks. The fire road climbs gradually for the first mile. It is wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. It is the way the maintenance crew brings tools up to the upper reaches of the mountain when repairs need to be made. On either side of it, the forest closes in tight, big oaks and hickories and some tulip poplars, with a layer of laurel and rhododendron below. In the fall, when the leaves have thinned, you can see far in between the trunks. You can see uphill and downhill. You can see the shapes of things standing still. At the 5th switchback, Buffalo Hump stopped. He raised a hand, and the whole line stopped with him. He turned off the road and went 10 paces into the leaves, and he crouched down. Parker followed. I followed Parker. In the soft ground beneath a stand of striped maple, there was a print. It was not a bear print. I have seen bear prints for 19 years. This was not one. It was long and narrow, the shape of a human foot but not the size, because the size was wrong. The heel-to-toe measurement was, at a rough guess with my hand, 17 inches. The toes were splayed and clearly defined. The pad of the ball was set deep enough into the wet leaves that I could see 2 deeper spots where whatever had made the print had put weight through its front step and then pushed off. There was a light dusting of frost around the edges of the print, but not inside it. The print was fresh, fresher than 3 hours, I thought, fresher than that. Buffalo Hump measured it with a length of paracord that he took from his pocket. He tied a knot at one end and pulled the cord taut and held it against the print, and he tied another knot, and then he stood up and coiled the cord and put it away. He did not say a number. He looked at Parker. Parker nodded. Quinai came up. He was the observer, the one who noticed. He was 60 years old, and thin and stooped, and carried a small pair of binoculars that had been made in East Germany 40 years ago. He crouched next to the print and looked at it, and then he did something that I have thought about, since, more times than I can count, he did not look at the print again. He stood up and he looked out into the forest, in a slow arc, moving his head like a lighthouse, and he studied the empty trees. He said, so softly that I almost missed it, "It is watching us now." Nobody moved. Ishitai closed his eyes. Parker said, quietly, "Which direction, brother?" Quinai did not point. He simply said, "Behind, about 60 steps, behind that fallen chestnut." I could not, from where I stood, see any fallen chestnut. But when I turned my head slowly to look uphill, I saw one, past a low ridge of rhododendron. A big chestnut, dead and down, its stump 7 feet across, its trunk lying at an angle across the slope. There were laurel and small pines around it. There were shadows behind it. I stared at those shadows for a long time. I could see nothing. Then, very slowly, one of the shadows moved. It did not move like an animal. An animal, when it moves, gives you a signature. A bear shifts its weight from side to side. A deer picks up its feet, one at a time. A person leans forward when they walk, and their arms and legs alternate. This did none of those things. It slid. Whatever was behind the chestnut simply took a single silent step to the left, and by the time my eyes had registered the motion, it was gone. Buffalo Hump said, in the calm voice of a man who has been in danger many times, "Ranger, turn slowly, stand up, walk back to the road." I did as he said. By the time I had reached the fire road, my hands were shaking. Before I take you further into this account, I want to ask something of any of you who are listening tonight. If you find yourself gripped by these stories, if you feel the cold of these hollows in your own room as I speak, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, leave a like on this episode, and drop a comment down below telling me which corner of these old mountains you would be brave enough to walk after sundown. Every single comment gets read, and every one of them helps the channel keep bringing you these accounts from the country nobody talks about in daylight. Now, let me tell you what happened next. We regrouped at the road. Parker gathered us in a loose circle. He said, "It has been ahead of us, and now it is behind us. It moved past our camp in the night. It has been walking with us since we left the trailhead yesterday. It knows our number. It knows we are 10. Yamparika, the strong one, the warrior, spoke for the first time since dawn. He said, "Uncle, what is your instruction?" Parker said, "We keep going. We do what we said we would do. But from now on, no one walks alone, and no one turns his back on the trees." We shouldered our packs and started up the road again. By late morning, the fire road had ended, and the trail had turned steep. This is the part of Old Rag that most people who come here remember for the rest of their lives. The trail leaves the forest and comes out onto the exposed granite of the upper mountain, and for the next mile, it is not a trail so much as a route between rocks. Some of the rocks are the size of buses, some are the size of houses. The route between them is a narrow, wandering, three-dimensional puzzle of squeezes, ledges, drops, and short climbs, some of which require you to use your hands. In good weather, in a crowd, it is one of the great outdoor experiences in the eastern United States. In late October, alone, in a cold gray wind, it is something else. We came up out of the last of the oaks and the ground opened. The wind hit us at once. It was not a hard wind. It was a low, steady, dry wind that came up the eastern face of the mountain and slid across the boulders and made a soft, continuous hush in the small pines that grew in the cracks. The sky was the color of an old iron pan. Wanderer was there, waiting. He came out from behind a boulder that leaned like a bad tooth against another. He had been sitting in the small shelter of it, and he had, judging by the color of his ears, been sitting there for most of the morning. Parker went to him, and the two men spoke, low and fast, in the language they shared. I could catch none of it, but when Parker turned back to us, his face had changed. It had not gone pale, it had gone still. He said, "Wanderer has found the second sign." He led us up. We climbed for 20 minutes, using our hands more than our feet, over the pale, rough granite. When you climb Old Rag in the daytime, in October, you can smell the stone. It is a mineral, cold, faintly metallic smell. On that day I could smell something else beneath it. I could smell, faintly, a wet animal smell, like a dog that has been in a pond for a long time. It was very faint. I mentioned it to Buffalo Hump, and he nodded, once, and said, "Yes." Wanderer stopped at the edge of a large flat rock. He pointed. On the surface of the flat rock, which was maybe 15 feet across, someone had arranged a pattern. It was small stones. They were deeper stones, taken from the cracks between the boulders, and they had been placed in a shape that at first looked like a random scatter. But when I stepped back and let my eye take it in, I saw that the shape was not random. It was a long, narrow triangle, wider at the base than at the point, with a small circle at the top of the point. The circle was made of 7 stones. Inside the circle, in the exact center, was a single tuft of what looked like coarse brown hair. Yustai spoke. He had not spoken since morning. His voice was rough and low, and he did not raise it. He said, "This is a warning, not a threat, a warning. It is telling us how far it will let us go before it changes its mind." Parker asked, "Who placed it?" Ishitai said, "It did, this morning, before we came up." I looked at the tuft of hair. It was the color of a red deer in winter, but coarser and thicker at the roots than any deer hair I had ever seen. I did not touch it. Tabananica, the doubter, was standing at the back of the group. He was very quiet. He was, I noticed, no longer wearing the easy smile that he had worn for most of the previous day. He was looking at the tuft of hair, and his lower jaw was set in a way that suggested he was working something out in his head, and that the working out was not going well. Hita Nakona said, "Uncle, do we cross it?" Parker looked at Ishitai. Ishitai looked at the pattern. Ishitai said, "We can cross it. If we do, we must not cross it again. Once we go past this point, we do not come back this way. We come down another way. We come down the west side. We come down through the pines and the saddle. If we come back through here, it will take one of us." There was a long silence. Buffalo Hump said, "How does he know?" Ishitai said, "Because this is the way my grandfather told me it was told to him. This is not the first time our people have stood here." That was the sentence that changed the trip for me. Up to that point, I had been treating this as an unusual assignment, I had been treating Parker's group as a group of respected visitors who had come to Old Rag for a purpose I did not fully understand, but was willing to support. From that sentence forward, I began to understand that I had walked into the middle of something that had been going on for 200 years, and that my part in it was small and, in Ishatai's eyes, mostly incidental. We crossed the pattern. We were careful not to disturb it. We walked around the flat rock. We continued up. The boulder field on Old Rag has a section, about halfway up, called the Squeeze. It is a narrow slot between two enormous rocks, and to get through, you must slide down on your back and then push through with your hands and knees. In the summer, on a Saturday, you can hear the whoops and yells of hikers echoing off the granite around it. On that day, the only sound was the wind. Parker went through first, then Buffalo Hump, then Petanocona, then Ishatai, then me. When I came out of the Squeeze, the wind had stopped. It had not slowed. It had stopped, completely. The small pines that had been rustling a moment before were now still. The air felt heavier. There was a faint pressure in my ears that I have felt only twice before in my life, both times before a summer thunderstorm broke. But there was no storm coming that I could see. Yamparika came through the Squeeze behind me. He rose to his feet, brushed the granite grit off his knees, and stood beside me. He looked around at the sudden stillness. He did not speak. He simply reached under his jacket and took out a knife with a bone handle, and made sure that the sheath moved freely on his belt. Tabananica came through after Yamparika. Then Coetti. Then Queen Eye. Nakoni was the last through. Wanderer had gone around, over the top of the boulder, and had come down on the other side without needing the Squeeze at all. He was standing on a ledge about 10 yards above us, looking down and to the east. He said one word, quietly, but loud enough that all of us heard him. There. We turned. Between two boulders, about 40 yards to the east of where we stood, on a small shelf of granite that faced out across the valley, something was sitting. It was not a bear. It was not a person. It was upright, and its shoulders were as wide as the shoulders of two men set beside each other. It was covered in coarse hair. Its head was set forward on its neck, in the way that a great ape's head is set forward, and its face was turned toward the valley, away from us. It was, so far as I could tell in the gray light, doing nothing at all. It was simply sitting on the granite, looking out. None of us moved. None of us breathed. After what seemed a very long time, but was probably no more than a slow count of 40, it turned its head. I have thought about that moment many times, and I have never found a way to describe what it felt like to have that face look at us. It was not the face of an animal. It was not the face of a human. It was, in the way that a mountain lion is not the same shape of thing as a house cat, related to us but very far away from us, on a road that had branched off long ago. Its eyes were set deep under a heavy ridge of bone. They were pale. They were not empty. It looked at us for perhaps 8 seconds. Then it stood up. It was, by the measure of the boulders around it, at least 8 feet tall. It did not run. It did not charge. It stepped, once, sideways off the granite shelf, and it was gone behind the boulder. Parker exhaled. I could hear him. I could hear all of us exhale, at almost the same moment, as if we had been holding one breath together. He said, "We have seen it. Now we go to the summit and we make our fire, and we speak the words that we came to speak, and we come down the west side before the sun goes low." We went up. The summit of Old Rag Mountain is a wide, uneven crown of granite, marked at its highest point by a small pile of stones that hikers add to and take from without permission. There is no view better in the Blue Ridge on a clear day. From the summit you can see west across the Shenandoah Valley to the long line of the Massanutten Range and beyond it, on the best days, to the higher ridges of the Alleghenies. To the east you can see the Piedmont fall away in a slow, quilted plain of farms and small towns. There is a plate mounted on a boulder that names some of the distant landmarks, and the names on the plate have been faded by wind and rain to the point of being nearly unreadable. On the day we came up, the summit was in a cloud. Not a heavy cloud, a thin, moving gray one that came and went across us in slow rolls. Sometimes we could see the plate on its boulder from 20 feet away, and then sometimes it disappeared for 30 seconds at a time and reappeared as the cloud shifted. The wind had come back on the summit, and it was colder than it had been on the boulder field, and I could see the breath of every person in our party. Parker sat down on a flat piece of granite near the plate. He motioned for the others to sit around him. He did not motion for me to sit. He looked at me, and I understood that I was to stand a short distance away, and that what was about to happen was not something I was expected to participate in. I moved back until I was 3 body lengths from the group, and I set my pack down, and I took out my thermos and I poured a cup of tea, and I stood and I listened. I understood only some of the words that were spoken. Parker spoke first, in a rhythm I recognized as ceremonial rather than conversational. His voice was steady. Ishatai answered him, then Buffalo Hump added a phrase. Then all of them, together, said a short line 3 times. Then Parker did something that surprised me. He took from his pack a small clay bowl, and he set it on the granite. He poured into it a small amount of water from a leather flask. He took a pinch of a dried gray-green plant from a pouch on his belt, and he sprinkled it on the water. And then he looked at Coetti. Coetti was crying. He had been crying, I think, since we had crossed the pattern of stones on the flat rock below. He had not made a sound. Tears had simply come and had not stopped. He came forward and knelt beside the bowl, and he took his mother's notebook out of the top pocket of his jacket, and he laid it on the granite next to the bowl. He put his hand on the notebook. Ishatai spoke a name. The name was not a name I knew. It was a woman's name in the language of the Comanche. Coetti did not respond in words. He simply lowered his head until his forehead touched the notebook, and he stayed that way for a long time. The cloud closed over us. For a full minute, I could not see the group at all. When it thinned again, Coetti was sitting back on his heels, and his eyes were closed, and his face was calm. Parker was watching him. Parker said, in English, quietly, "It is done. She has been thanked. Now we go." We stood up. We shouldered our packs. Queenie, at the back, said, "It is close." We looked in the direction he was looking. There, on a lower shelf of granite about 30 yards below the summit, a shape was standing. It was the same shape. It was standing this time. It was watching us. It was not, as far as I could tell, moving. Hitanokona took a step in front of his father. It was not a threatening step. It was a positioning step. He simply put himself between his father and the shape, and he did not draw a weapon, and he did not shout. He simply stood. Yamparika did the same on the other side. Nokoni brought his rifle up from behind his shoulder, and he checked the action once, and he did not raise it. The shape, on the lower shelf, took 2 steps back. It did not turn. It did not run. It simply moved backward, into a fold of granite, and was gone. Parker said, "It has answered. We go down the west side. Ranger, you will lead. We follow." I did not want to lead. I had led parties in this park for 19 years, but I did not want to lead this one. I did it anyways because Parker had asked, and because there was, at the top of Old Rag Mountain in the last hours of that afternoon, no one else it could have been. We went down. The west descent from Old Rag runs along the saddle trail. It drops from the summit into a long, shallow depression between 2 rises, then continues down through open forest to the Bird's Nest Shelter, and from there to Old Rag Shelter, and then out through the Weekly Hollow Road. In good conditions, it takes 3 hours. In late afternoon, in October, with the sun already touching the top of the ridge behind us, it would take 4. We did not have 4 hours before nightfall. I told Parker this as we started down. He nodded. He said, "We will camp at Bird's Nest tonight. We will finish the descent in the morning." Bird's Nest Shelter is a 3-sided stone shelter with a wooden floor and a metal roof. It sits in a small clearing about a mile below the summit on the west side. It is used most of the year by through hikers on the shorter loop who need a place to wait out weather. It has a stone hearth. It has a picnic table. It has a privy about 30 steps into the trees. It also has, at the back of the clearing, an old spring that used to be reliable and is now only sometimes reliable, depending on the season. We reached it as the last light was going out of the sky. Buffalo Hump was the first to notice. He had gone to the spring to check whether it was running. He came back and he did not speak. He simply walked up to Parker and he touched Parker on the wrist. Parker went to the spring with him. I followed, because I could not help myself. Around the small stone basin of the spring, in the soft earth, was a ring of prints. Not one, a ring. 12, or perhaps 14, in a rough circle, spaced about a stride and a half apart. All the same size, all fresh, all facing the spring. Something had walked around and around the spring, in a slow circle, sometime in the last hour. Ishitai came up behind us. He looked at the ring of prints. He did not speak. He turned and walked back to the shelter, and he began, very calmly, to build a large fire. We built the fire large, larger than we needed, larger than the shelter's hearth was really made for. Nakoni and Yamparika hauled Deadfall in from the edges of the clearing, and Wanderer went for a longer walk down the trail and came back with an armful of dry hemlock branches, and we built a fire that pushed a cone of light out into the clearing and gave us, if not comfort, at least a boundary that we could see the edges of. We divided the night into watches. Parker made the assignments. He put himself and Buffalo Hump on the first watch. He put Peta Nokona and Yamparika on the second. He put Wanderer and Nakoni on the third. He asked me to take a fourth, an hour before dawn, with Quinai. Ishitai, he said, was not to stand watch. Ishitai was to sleep, if he could, because Ishitai was needed rested. Tabananika and Coetti, being the two youngest and the two most affected by the day, were also to try to sleep. I lay down on the wooden floor of the shelter, with my pack under my head, and I closed my eyes. I did not sleep, but I rested. I listened. I heard Parker and Buffalo Hump speaking, in low voices, in the language I did not know. I heard the fire settle and pop. I heard the wind, high above, moving in the tops of the trees. At some point in the first watch, an owl called. It was a barred owl, giving the 8-note call that you sometimes hear translated as, "Who cooks for you?" I heard it clearly. I had heard barred owls 1,000 times in this park. Then, from a different direction, I heard the exact same call. It was not a real owl. The pitch was slightly wrong. The tempo was slightly wrong. The pauses between the notes were too regular. Whatever had made that second call had heard the first, and had reproduced it, and had done a very careful, very close, but not quite perfect job. Buffalo Hump said, quietly, "Ranger, are you awake?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you hear that?" I said, "Yes." He said, "That is what my grandfather described." I sat up. Parker was standing at the edge of the shelter, looking out into the clearing. His breath made a slow cloud in the light of the fire. He did not move. He watched. The false owl called a third time. It was closer. Then, from another direction, a fourth call. Different pitch, different rhythm, but the same style. It was, we understood at the same moment, more than one voice. There were at least 2 of them out there, possibly 3. Ishitai woke. He sat up on his blanket, and his eyes were clear, and he did not seem afraid. He said something to Parker. Parker nodded. Parker said, aloud, in English, so that I could hear, "They are speaking to each other about us. They are asking one another whether we are dangerous. They have not decided yet." I said, "What do we do if they decide?" Parker said, "We hope that they do not." We waited. The false owl calls continued, spaced far enough apart that they no longer seemed like communication so much as a slow pacing, a circling. I began to think that we were being surrounded. It was not, in the strict sense, a hunter's tactic. It was more like the way that a family of coyotes will spread out around a piece of ground before they decide whether to enter it. It was patient. It was thorough. It was terrible to sit inside. At some point during Peta Nokona and Yamparika's watch, one of the calls was answered by a low, wet, resonant sound that I have not heard before or since, and that I hope I will not hear again. It was not a growl. It was not a moan. It was a note of communication, produced deep in the chest of something very large, and it carried through the trees in a way that made the bones behind my ears vibrate slightly. Yamparika turned toward the sound. He did not speak. He simply set another log on the fire, and he sat back down on his heels. The wet, resonant sound came again. Ashitai raised his head. He said one sentence, quietly. Parker translated for me, in a whisper. He says, "It is old, and it is asking us to leave in the morning." I said, "That is a mercy." Parker said, "It is a warning." Then Tabernanica screamed. He had gone, at some point during the second watch, out to the privy. I had not seen him go. I do not think Parker had seen him go. He had gone quietly, thinking, I suspect, that he did not want to wake anyone. He had gone about 30 steps into the trees. He had used the privy. He had started back. He was, when he screamed, about 10 steps from the shelter. Yamparika was on his feet in an instant. Peta Nokona was up beside him. Nokoni had his rifle from behind his shoulder before the second scream. Wanderer, who had been sleeping, was up and out of the shelter in one fluid motion, and he was moving toward the sound with a long knife in his hand before I had cleared the doorway. I ran with them. We found Tabernanica on the ground, 10 feet from the trail. He was on his back. He was alive. He was uninjured. He was staring straight up into the tops of the trees, and his face was the wrong color, and his mouth was open, and he was not making a sound. 10 yards further, on a low limb of a hemlock about 15 feet off the ground, there was a shape. It was crouched. It was folded into itself in the way that a great ape folds itself when it means to be still. Its long arms were wrapped around the branch. Its eyes reflected the light of the flashlight that Yamparika turned up into the tree, and they reflected it back at us as 2 pale flat coins. Nokoni raised the Winchester. Parker's hand came down on the barrel. He pushed the barrel down. He said, quietly, "No, not tonight. Not unless it comes for us." The shape did not come for us. It did not move. It did not blink. It watched us pick Tabernanica up off the ground and carry him back to the shelter. And it watched us return to the fire. And it watched us not sleep. At some time in the third watch, when Wanderer and Nokoni were on, we heard the false owl one more time. It was, this time, farther away. It was moving off. Ishitai said, "It is going. We will see it once more. Then it will be done for this trip." Tabernanica did not speak for the rest of the night. He sat by the fire, wrapped in 2 blankets, and he stared at the coals. Coetti sat beside him and held his hand. When it was my turn on watch, Quinai came and stood beside me at the edge of the shelter. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, in a soft, thoughtful voice, "You will not tell them when we are down. You will not put this in your log." I said, "No, I will not." He said, "Good. This story is not for the log. This story is for the people who are ready to hear it. It has never been for the log." I nodded. He said, quietly, "Thank you for standing with us on this mountain, Ranger. My grandfather stood with a man like you, once, in a different country. He said the same thing about him then." He walked back to the fire and sat down. Dawn came slow. We left Bird's Nest Shelter at first light. We did not eat. We did not linger. We packed our gear in silence, put out the fire, buried the ashes, and started down the trail. Wanderer went ahead. Buffalo Hump followed close behind him. Then the rest of us in a tight line, with Nokoni and his old Winchester at the rear. The morning was very cold. There was ice in the puddles along the trail, and the frost had settled thick on the leaves, and the light came slantwise through the trees in long pale bars. We walked without speaking. We watched the trees. For the first 2 miles, we saw and heard nothing. Then, at a bend in the trail where the path crosses a small drainage between 2 ridges, Wanderer stopped. He held up a hand. We all stopped behind him. He pointed uphill. About 60 yards up the slope, above the trail, standing beside a large oak whose bark had been scarred by a bear a long time ago. It was there. It was standing in full daylight this time. There was no cloud. There was no shadow. It was standing at the top of the low ridge, and it was watching us come down. I could see, for the first time, and the last, what we had been walking with for 2 days. It was, as I had thought, about 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were half again as wide as the widest man among us. It was covered entirely in a coat of coarse hair that was neither black nor brown, but somewhere between the two, and that had, along the shoulders and the top of the head, a lighter brindled quality, as if the animal were older than its size at first suggested. Its arms were very long. Its hands, at the end of those arms, were plainly visible, with fingers that looked disturbingly like our own fingers, and that were held loose and open at its sides. Its face I will describe only once. It had a heavy brow. Beneath the brow, its eyes were pale, and they were, as I have said, not empty. They were watching us with a kind of steady attention that I have seen, in my career as a ranger, in exactly two other creatures, a very old bull elk that had watched me for several minutes from 100 yards away in the Dolly sods, and a mountain lion that had watched me from a distance of 30 feet across a canyon in Montana, and had chosen in the end not to come. Its jaw was heavy, its nose was flat, its mouth was closed. It was not baring its teeth. It was not making any expression that I could read. It was simply watching us go. Parker stopped at the front of the group. He turned to face the ridge. He raised his hand, palm out, in a slow, deliberate motion, held it there for perhaps 5 seconds, and lowered it. The creature raised, on its side, one of its long arms. Its palm was out. It held the palm up for perhaps 3 seconds. It lowered its arm. Parker turned back to the trail. He said, quietly, "We go. We do not look back again." We walked. I did not look back. I heard Buffalo Hump behind me draw one long, slow breath and let it out, and I understood that he was letting go of something that he had been holding in his chest since the moment on the fire road when he had first found the print. We reached the Weekly Hollow Road at a little past 10 in the morning. The parking lot at the trailhead was empty except for our 3 vehicles. The sun was up. The sky had cleared. It was, by every measurable sign, a bright autumn morning in Shenandoah National Park. We loaded the packs into the vehicles. Tabananica, who had not spoken since the night before, turned to Parker at the door of the truck. He said, "Uncle, I did not believe." Parker said, "You believe now." Tabananica said, "Yes." Parker put his hand on Tabananica's shoulder. He said, "That is enough. Get in the truck." Coetti came to me before he got in. He held out his hand. In his hand was a small object, wrapped in a scrap of leather. He said, "This was in my mother's notebook. She would have wanted you to have it. She wrote your name in the margin of the page beside it, and it was the only page she left with a name." I took it. I did not open it in front of him. He nodded and got in the truck. Parker was the last to leave. He walked over to me and offered his hand. I took it. We stood there for a moment, in the empty parking lot at the base of Old Rag, with the mountain above us and the smell of wood smoke still on our jackets. He did not smile. He said, "You are a good man, Ranger. Do not tell the story unless you know who is listening. If you tell it wrong, it will hurt someone. If you tell it to a person who is not ready, it will hurt them too. That is why it is a slow story. That is why it is passed the way it is passed." I said, "I understand." He said, "Good. Then we will not see each other again." He got in the truck. I watched the 3 vehicles turn out of the parking lot and go down the road toward Sperryville, and I stood there for a long time after they were gone. And then I got in my own truck, and I drove to the ranger station, and I filed a report that said, "Guided party of 10. Uneventful 2-night backcountry trip. Descended by west route. All members accounted for. No incidents." That is what my logbook says. That is not what happened. I have opened the scrap of leather only once. What was inside it, I will not describe here. I will say only that it was old, and that it was smooth from having been carried a very long time, and that when I hold it in my hand at night, in my house, at the edge of the park, I sometimes think I can hear, very faintly, at the very edge of what my hearing can catch, a low resonant note in a wet chest very far away, and I put it back in the drawer, and I go to sleep. Old Rag Mountain still gets its Saturday crowds. It gets its 200 cars in the parking lot on a good day in June. It gets its hikers on the boulder scramble, and their whoops echo off the granite in the pleasant way that they should. Most of them come down. Some of them do not. Every year, 1 or 2 people go missing on that mountain, and the search parties find some of them and do not find others, and the ones that are not found are written up as accidents, as falls into crevices between boulders, as hypothermia on unexpectedly cold nights. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are not. I have thought, many times, about going back up. I have not gone. Parker told me not to, in his way, and I have listened. When he said, "We will not see each other again," he was, I think, telling me 2 things at once. He was telling me that his part in the story was finished, and he was telling me that mine was too. I keep the piece of leather in a drawer. I do not open the drawer often. Old Rag Mountain sits above the valley, quiet, gray, patient, the same as it has been for a long time before I was born, and will be for a long time after I am gone. It has, in the folds of its granite and in the shadows behind its fallen chestnuts, tenants that the maps do not show. It has been walked by people whose names do not appear in the visitor register. Parker walked it. Pedonocona walked it. Buffalo Hump, Ishitai, Tabananica, Yamparika, Coetti, Queenai, Noconi, and Wanderer walked it. One ranger walked it with them. That ranger is telling you this now. Take from it what you will. Sleep well.